All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jim Shermer, and on behalf of Moritz's chapter of the Federalist Society and the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, would like to welcome you to our event titled Legalize It, Marijuana in Our Federalist System. Before I begin, I want to express my gratitude to our esteemed panelists, Professor Jonathan Adler, Mr. Tom Haren, and Dr. David Murray, and our moderator, Professor Doug Berman, for bringing this day to fruition. This event was originally scheduled for April 9th, but had to be canceled and rescheduled. And while that seems long ago, we aimed high, adapted, persevered, overcame, made some tweaks, and are now finally here. This topic is of ever greater importance and relevance here in the 50th anniversary of the Controlled Substances Act, under which marijuana remains Schedule I and federally illegal. However, recreational use of cannabis is legal at the state level in 15 states and four that legalized a couple weeks ago, the District of Columbia and 2 U.S. territories. While illegal recreationally, it is legal for medicinal use in another 33 states, including Ohio and 2 U.S. territories. Additionally, it has been decriminalized in 16 states overall, including Ohio and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Only 2 states prohibit cannabis use for any use at all. This creates tension and shows competing interests between the states and federal government and has huge implications for our economy, incarceration, and beyond. Before we begin, I want to introduce both FedSoc and the DEPC, and finally, our panelists. The Federalist Society is founded on the principles that the state exists to preserve freedom, that the separation of governmental powers is central to our Constitution, and that it is emphatically the province and the duty of the judiciary to say what the law is, not what it should be. The Society seeks to both promote an awareness of these principles and to further their application through its activities. While typically consisting of conservative and libertarian students interested in the current state of the legal order, the Federalist Society at Moritz welcomes a diverse spectrum of beliefs and aims to encourage respectful dialogue through its programming. The Drug Enforcement and Policy Center draws on the interdisciplinary strengths of a number of colleges and departments across the Ohio State University. Its mission is to focus on promoting and supporting interdisciplinary, evidence-based research, scholarship, education, community outreach, and public engagement on the issues and societal impacts surrounding the legal reforms of prohibition or regulation of the use and the distribution of traditionally illicit drugs. It examines the impact of modern drug laws, policies, and enforcement on personal freedoms and human well-being, and giving particular attention to the evolution of marijuana laws and the impacts of state-level reform efforts. Now to introduce our panelists. Mr. Tom Haren is one of the most sought-after attorneys serving the Ohio and national cannabis industry, in which he represents licensed operators in medical and adult use markets, ancillary service providers, and companies operating in the hemp industry. Mr. Haren is also a contributor to various local and national media outlets and often shares his expertise by speaking at industry conferences and events. Dr. David Murray took a PhD from the University of Chicago in social anthropology and subsequently taught at several major research universities before entering federal service in Washington, D.C. Dr. Murray served in the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy from 2001 until 2014, most prominently as chief scientist. He is currently a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. His most recent publication is found in the new Springer volume, Cannabis in Medicine. Professor Jonathan H. Adler is the inaugural Jonathan Verhey Memorial Professor of Law and Director of the Coleman P. Burke Center for Environmental Law at the Case Western Reserve University School of Law, where he teaches courses in administrative, constitutional, and environmental law. His books include Marijuana Federalism, Uncle Sam and Mary Jane, and the Business and the Roberts Court. He is a contributing editor to National Review Online and a regular contributor to the popular legal blog, The Volokh Conspiracy, hosted at reason.com. Professor Douglas Berman's principal teaching and research focus is in the area of criminal law and criminal sentencing, though he also has teaching and practice experience in the fields of legislation and intellectual property. He is a sole creator and author of the widely read and widely cited blog, Sentencing Law and Policy, the first blog to be cited by the Supreme Court. Professor Berman has also served as an editor of the Federal Sentencing Reporter and now serves as the co-managing editor of Moritz's own Ohio State Journal of Criminal Law and is the Executive Director of the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center here at Moritz. Now, thank you all for bearing with me, and now that I feel woefully unaccomplished, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Professor Berman.
Thank you so much, Jim. That's impressive work getting through all those introductions so effectively. If law doesn't work out, emceeing maybe is in your future. But I'm extraordinarily grateful to you, to everybody involved with the Federalist Society for putting this together. The Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, which I helped get started, was really built out of a sense that we needed to have more sophisticated discussion around the set of issues when it comes to drug policy reform generally and marijuana reform in particular. And I'm extraordinarily excited to be able to serve as moderator to get three very, very bright people to talk about their perspective on this basic question of legalizing it. And I especially think the Federalist Society is a perfect one to partner with in these conversations, because as we may get to when we get to the Q&A, the structure of government is so much a part of this conversation, and which part of government kind of should be integral to doing this, and especially because we are in many ways building the plane as we're flying it when it comes to policy and practice here, to have opportunities like this to sort of talk through the issues and get different perspectives on how we're doing, I think is incredibly invaluable. For the audience's sake, I'll let you know that I'm going to get out of the way in a minute. You've heard the introductions. I'm going to let each of the speakers have about up to 8 minutes to sort of give their take on the basic issue. We'll start with Mr. Haren, then move to Dr. Murray, and then finish with Professor Adler. After that conversation, I've got a couple questions, but we have time for audience questions built in to the hour. So please use the Q&A function if you've got some thoughts about things you'd like to make sure we follow up on after we have the initial presentations. And so with that, I'll go right to you, Mr. Haren. I call you Tom because we go back a ways as well, and I've had the pleasure of having you speak to my marijuana seminar, and so I look forward to seeing your take on this issue as of today.
Thanks, Professor. And I really do want to thank the Federalist Society and the Moritz College of Law for the honor of being on this panel with such esteemed co-panelists here. It really, I really appreciate the opportunity to present and talk about these issues. The American preference for marijuana reform, I think, is on a clear trajectory, as evidenced by the votes that we just saw in South Dakota, Montana, Arizona, New Jersey, and Mississippi last week. And there's good reason for that. Marijuana reform works. Regulated markets work. And prohibition has failed. Prohibition has served as one of the primary weapons of a heavy-handed criminal justice system over the last 50 years, leading to the arrest, prosecution, and incarceration of millions of Americans. It has stood in the way and prevented meaningful research on cannabis, as well as other drugs, that could guide policymakers when they adopt regulatory frameworks. I mean, one of the things that we hear over and over again from state regulators in new markets is that there is not sufficient research on marijuana, on the science behind it, on consumer use, effects on the body, et cetera. And that's largely a result of prohibition. It's also prevented access for terminally and chronically ill patients in states without legal markets who can benefit from the medicinal properties of legal medical marijuana. And perhaps most importantly, prohibition has failed at its own stated goal. Marijuana has remained consistently available to any consumer who desired to purchase it since the day after the Controlled Substances Act was enacted. We spent billions of dollars on drug-free school programs, and I would suggest we don't have a single drug-free school in the United States of America. And a lot of the problems that critics like to use, or a lot of the things that critics like to criticize marijuana usage for, are really the result of continued prohibition. They're not caused by using or buying marijuana. One goal of reform, one of the critics of marijuana is that, it furthers the black market, helps drug cartels, et cetera. Well, that's because you're prohibiting a legal framework. So when you force consumers into the black market, don't be surprised when the black market flourishes. And one goal of reform, which is working, it certainly is not yet complete, is to reduce reliance on the black market by allowing consumers to purchase through a regulated industry. You know, there were some estimates a couple of years ago that by this year, 90% of marijuana purchased in Colorado would be purchased through a legal operator. I candidly don't know whether we've hit that 90% goal, but if we're anywhere close to it, that's a huge success story for the state of Colorado. And to the extent that black markets still exist in states with legal programs, I would again suggest that that's largely because of artificial restrictions caused by government regulation. For example, it can be hard for a legal operator to compete on price with the black market. But that's because legal operators tend to pay high taxes or their products are taxed when they're sold to consumers. Obviously, the black market, there is no tax. And operators have heavy compliance burdens that result in costs to produce legal products that, again, black market operators don't have. So that inability to compete or the difficulty in competing with the black market can be traced back in large part to artificial restrictions placed on the legal market by governments. And the same is true for consumer choice. If you want to buy marijuana flower, for example, but legal operators in your state aren't permitted to sell legal flower, you've only got one option. Same if you are a patient in a state and you exceed the supply limit that's placed on your ability to purchase marijuana. Here in Ohio, for example, it's basically a 90-day supply. And once you hit your 90-day supply as set by the Board of Pharmacy, you can no longer purchase medical marijuana at a dispensary. So then you only have one option, and that's to turn back to the unregulated market. And, you know, we've seen some states where they've had a problem with diversion of product into the black market. And you can look at, you know, the lawsuits that were filed by Nebraska, and I think it was Oklahoma in 2014, where they filed a lawsuit against Colorado and said that they were going to see a flood of product coming across the state from Colorado into Nebraska and into Oklahoma, supposedly from legal operators in the state of Colorado. Well, to the extent that's true, I would suggest that that's a problem caused by the fact that Nebraska and Oklahoma continue to have a policy of prohibition in those states. And again, if you're forcing consumers to purchase from the black market, don't be surprised when they do. And as we have this conversation here today, I think it can be easy to turn from the argument of should marijuana be legal and instead start talking about, is it a good idea to use marijuana? A lot of critics of marijuana reform say that reform's a bad idea because marijuana usage itself is not a good idea. It can have effects on youth users, right? On brain development, IQ, et cetera. Smoking can have impacts on your lung functions. I mean, there are certainly adverse health consequences that arise out of marijuana usage, but I don't think it necessarily follows that just because there are adverse health consequences, you need to arrest, prosecute, and incarcerate somebody for using that product. There are all kinds of bad stuff that people consume that are legal. You know, fast food, sugary candy, alcohol, tobacco, keeping up with the Kardashians. There are all kinds of really bad stuff that we don't arrest people for. And I think marijuana falls into that category. I was listening to a podcast that Malcolm Gladwell was on, I think over the summer or at some point. And he was talking about the way that we regulate and think about marijuana from a policy perspective. And he made the point that I thought was a good one, that when you look at the collateral consequences of marijuana usage and compare it to the sort of collateral consequences from alcohol or tobacco, we really kind of have our regulation of those substances sort of completely backwards. If somebody chooses to abuse alcohol, it not only harms themselves, but they're more likely to be abusive, they have trouble keeping a job. And then you look at a substance like marijuana, where you don't necessarily have those same consequences. When I used to do criminal defense work, just about every violent crime, whether it was domestic violence or an assault case, generally started with somebody drinking. I don't think I had a single case where a client said to me, you know, we were all sitting around, we were getting high, and then we got into an argument, and then we got into a fight. So when you look at the collateral consequences of using marijuana, again, I think from a policy perspective, I'm seeing my time is up. So I'll stop there and just say, I think marijuana from a policy standpoint is less dangerous than certainly alcohol. So I'll turn it back. Thank you.
There we go. Still haven't learned after all these months how to remember to demute. Thank you, Tom, for those comments. We're going to now move to Dr. Murray, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, sir. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor. Appreciate it. Good to see Jonathan again. He remembers from years ago. He's done well and does good papers. My politics certainly inclined towards federalism as a generalized idea, but I think it falls right into what you precisely characterized my posture as. Is it applicable appropriately to the problem of addictive substances, particularly given the epidemic nature of the converging crises we are facing in the drug policy scene in America? And I think it is not appropriate, and that the scope of the federal response is necessary. Not everywhere, and I think there's also a sort of, I wouldn't say myopia, but a kind of narrow understanding, certainly in academic settings, of what exactly national drug control policy entails. It's not just about arresting for possession and use. Let's be honest, that's never really been a major issue. I know that there are data that people put out that are very misleading. About 0.3% of all federal prisoners are there for possession or use. Majority have pled down. Anyone who's done sentencing analysis knows these things. At state incarceration level, it's very few. 16% around at the maximum are there for possession and use, almost always because there are collateral criminal penalties assessed by virtue of other actions that accompany the possession and use, including violence, including multiple repeat offenses. Great majority of people we find incarcerated are there for trafficking and heavy trafficking. The drug control policy, however, is not just about cannabis. Cannabis is inextricably linked with the prevalence and use of the entire crisis for driving epidemic that we are experiencing currently, the flood of methamphetamine, cocaine, opioids from crop sources, and now the synthetics such as fentanyl from China. Additional synthetics appearing on the scene, and very high potency cannabis are linked together in the careers of users and in the careers of providers, the traffickers who produce and convey and profit from their criminal enterprise. They cannot be segregated out. And effectively, possession and use of marijuana per se has been decriminalized at the level of state governments and at the federal level and internationally for years. RAND analysis pointed this out years ago that effectively in no Western country is anybody severely penalized for mere possession and use. It's for trafficking. Our current tolls, we're losing about 75,000 people a year in the United States as mortalities for drug overdose, and it's rising. And the morbidities that are associated with drug use are overwhelming and incredible, uncountable effectively. Most among the young, it's a pediatric onset disease, and it is more than a disease. And what really troubles me is that it was given to us in a very roundabout, and I think misleading way, the legalization movement, initially provided by medical marijuana, which I regard as basically fraudulent claim on science, that the denial that the gateway effect is real, it is. I think robust science now supports that. And that high potency cannabis is feeding the entire epidemic crisis. It's just very troubling to see that drug control policy involves public health dimensions, criminal justice dimensions, and importantly and critically, national security dimensions. It's a transnational global partnership where people have to interfere with the production, the distribution of transnational criminal organizations that have international havens that bring the substance here. And Colorado has been basically a disaster. I think any fair appraisal of the public health consequences, the criminal justice consequences, and the smuggling consequences of Colorado's distribution to not only other states within the United States, but internationally, is stunning. Jonathan's paper answers one of the questions I think was important, and I did read it. It's about how did we get here? And it should be remembered, this really is not federalism in the sense, and you brought this issue up earlier, Professor. It's been by state ballot initiative to a large extent. Now, what exactly is that an expression of? It's been an expression of a 20-year campaign driven by billionaire money to find any avenue possible to move forward at the state or local level. And they simply switch gears from whether it's going to be a state initiative ballot process, or whether it's going to be buy off the New Mexico State Senate, or whether it's going to be, and almost always advanced by a series of systematic and very misleading claims about incarceration impact, about racial injustice, about driving the criminals out of the enterprise, and about protecting youth. None of these promises has been sustained in any setting in which they have been adopted. And here, I believe, is the critical problem with the black market. It is not an accident or a vestige of a former system that people resort to the black market. It is because the black market is the central player on the global stage of transnational criminal organizations. It is essentially the illicit market in its overwhelming framework, particularly in the United States. Wherever state law becomes more liberal, the illicit market seizes greater control over the expanded prevalence in all those states. The respective state legal regimes, the amount of taxation, the amount of stuff you can take home in a 90-day period, these are irrelevant to whether or not the black market thrives and capitalizes. Its methods are different. Its methods are violence, terror, coercion, death. California is besieged with this problem. And the problem was they didn't stage their drug control policy right. Could there be a legal regulated market in cannabis substances? Yes. Would I accept it? I'd be unhappy with it because of the mental health consequences. Nonetheless, it could be done, but not in the presence of a pre-existing black market. The staging has to be, you must break that system first. Then you can begin to build what you would like to see as a regulated approach. And no one has taken the energy and the wherewithal to address that until they realize they're losing taxation revenue and the black market is still slaughtering people, and it's been taken over by transnational criminal organizations who've moved into California and Colorado and Washington and Oregon and are systematically smuggling internationally and using violence and coercion to do it, and are further entrapping youth. And if you do not break them, you cannot possibly move to a framework of building something different. That's just academic wishful thinking. My experience is not as an academic in this field. My experience was in office, trying to construct and hold together international drug control policies that included engaging with the nature of the threat that is actually facing us and it's undermining us and to which we are being subject. All right, I don't want to go through all the issues about exactly how dangerous is marijuana in and of itself, other than to say it feeds the opioid epidemic very clearly, and it has devastating impact for young people particularly, devastating in the sense of a mental health crisis emerging. Clear links to schizophrenia, psychosis, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, school failure, serious problems with sustained exposure to high potency marijuana at around age 15 to 18 that is leading to an extension of prevalence. The rate in the United States is now, under the current legalization patchwork, growing around 8% a year of prevalence expansion and an intensification at the same time of the use patterns. We're seeing more and more and more the disorderly and very damaging dependency profile of early in adolescence use at very high potencies of a new kind of compound, the shatter, the butter, the 70 to 90% potency THC, and we're seeing daily use as the emerging pattern. These people are getting into serious psychological, psychotic circumstances as a virtue of this. All of them? No, primarily those with pre-existing comorbidities or inclinations, but it's having an enormously powerful effect on large numbers of the population that are growing, and in many cases, their lives are literally catastrophically overturned by their dependency. So what do you do if you are in an adjacent state and you're assured that the laboratories of democracy are operating where the legalization has gone forward through some ballot initiative? And you say, but it's spilling into my world. I cannot define myself under federalism in such a way that we are not subject to this exposure, this rampant smuggling, this impact on our own youth. The Brandeis quote was about experiments that do not risk the rest of the country. And I'm saying to you, that does not fit the profile of what we're seeing. We're seeing experiments that do risk the rest of the country, particularly now at the international level, when basically we're seeing poisons under chemical attack being shipped from China into Mexico and directly imported here. This is fentanyl, with emerging carfentanyl. It's producing a staggering toll in the United States, including staggering violence associated with this distribution. That is linked to the marijuana market at the high potency level controlled by the black market and its funding. So these are the consequences of enabling this to become a runaway. All right, so I'll just sum up. I know my time is short here. Here are the sort of 5 statements I would make that need to be addressed from my point of view. I haven't heard no answers from Federalists about how these states that have not adopted this can be protected under a patchwork regime if we do not resort to the federal level. And I think the federal government's responsibility here, because of the international nature of drug control responses and challenges, has to be the preeminent one. Notice, by the way, the Obama administration declined to achieve clarity in that. They declined to pursue federal supremacy as a court issue with regards to the memos that abrogated their responsibilities at the state level with regard to effective law enforcement and control. And they set in motion 5 red lines that were going to control whether or not the federal presence would reinstill itself. All those red lines were blatantly crossed immediately in Colorado, and there was no federal response. So my sense would be, this is a violent, illicit market in the first instance. They must be defeated in the field. Otherwise, they will rampage and take over whatever you provide. I learned this lesson in Colombia, in Peru, in Mexico, and Afghanistan. Every time we went in with alternative development programs, they simply grabbed those and continued with the force of guns to take on greater efficiencies of their own markets. They now control about 30% of the territory of Mexico, profound and total corruption and penetration of that government. 2, the public health is facing a catastrophe from legalization. High potency is creating a mental health crisis. Every social familial pathology grows worse. I have heard just now that alcohol is the primary cause of disorder in the family. Child endangerment caregivers are very clear about this. I can give you a paper from Texas. Marijuana is the leading substance associated with caregiver child endangerment fatalities. 85 2019 cited fatalities that were marijuana driven. Next is meth at 21 fatalities. There's some serious problem here with psychosis that is affecting caregivers and child endangerment. Finally, think about the pregnancy and unborn issues. THC is teratogenic. I have no idea how the law firms supporting the new cannabis industry are going to be prepared for the liability hazard that is coming their way with regard to teenage psychosis, teratogenic effects on the unborn, and the difficulties and disabilities that are going to be emerging here. So we are now, I think, faced with, can we limit the impact to one state under our federalist model? I don't see how possible. International criminal organizations control these operations. They are violent. They are now penetrating into our own government and into its finances and seek it to get banking and finances to somehow accept the marijuana illegal at the federal level funding as somehow acceptable. If they do so, they will be the source for laundering multiple proceeds from their other enterprises into the US financial and business sector that will also influence US politics, I fear. I do not think that this is a matter of freedom, it's a matter of poisoning. We still have the 3 dimensions: public health, criminal justice institutions, and national security. They all must be united and integrated in a way that can be strategically useful. Arkansas does not fund the Navy, the federal government does. That means a federal presence is going to be there for the global fight with treaties. We can no more fight counter-narcotics globally than we can fight counterterror globally at the state level. It's not Colorado's responsibility. It is the United States' responsibility. And when we've been successful internationally, which we have been, it's been because we adopted the authorities that expanded our capacity to intervene and operate, such as in Colombia, where counter-narcotics and counter-terror were seen as united in the sense that it was the same actors doing narco-state activities. That means at some level, the federal government's presence is essential and cannot be driven out of the system if we're going to survive. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Murray. And now, Professor Adler, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Always like talking to my friends at Ohio State. It's always more fun to do it in person, but obviously conditions require doing it this way. You know, I want to say kind of, I'm coming at this issue slightly different from both Tom and David, and I certainly appreciate sharing the webinar with them. In that I think our views about whether or not marijuana should or should not be legal should really be secondary to how, as a legal and constitutional matter, we should deal with the question of what substances should be legal under what conditions and when we invoke the criminal law to deal with that. And under our system of government, we recognize that the federal government is one of limited and enumerated powers, and that the residual police power to protect health, safety, and morals is held by the states. The federal government's power to criminalize things is constrained to those areas that relate to an enumerated power. And further, the very structure of our government presumes that the federal government is only going to be involved in those areas where it has a particular comparative advantage or there is a particular national interest. And I don't think when we're talking about marijuana or other substances, alcohol and the like, there is a distinct federal interest that justifies federal prohibition. So when I look at the landscape of what's been going on in our country, the fact that as of this month, 15 states in the District of Columbia have approved recreational use of marijuana. An additional more than a dozen states have decriminalized low-level possession. A clear majority of states, about 2/3 of the states, allow medicinal use under some conditions, and then even more states allow limited use of some cannabis derivatives, CBD oils and the like. It's very clear that most people in most of the country think that at least trying some form of decriminalization or legalization of marijuana is a good idea. Now, since my view is that this is the sort of thing that we should deal with at the state level, and we see states doing this, moving fairly rapidly towards changing their marijuana laws in accord with the preferences of the people of the various states, you might think that my view is, well, then everything's fine, and that we should just stick with what appears to be working. But that's not my view. My view is not that everything's fine, because while I believe that states should be allowed to adopt the marijuana policies that are in line with the preferences and values and priorities of the people of the individual states, even though I believe that is what our federal system is about, that is in fact not what the status quo entails. Under the current status quo, the fact that marijuana remains prohibited at the federal level, that its distribution, its cultivation, its possession is illegal at the federal level, has hangover effects or collateral effects on the way marijuana markets develop in the state level, and actually limits the ability of the federal government to play a more proper role of helping reinforce and protect states in pursuing and executing their own policy preferences. So for example, the fact that marijuana remains illegal means that under federal banking law, banks cannot certify to the federal government that they are not facilitating financial transactions involving illegal substances, because facilitating transactions involving marijuana are illegal under federal law, no matter what the law of the relevant state or local jurisdiction is. That is one reason why during the Obama administration, an administration that tried to be favorable to state experiments, they could not give any banks any clear approval for providing the financial backing and financial services for marijuana-related businesses anywhere in the country. What that means is that non-federally licensed entities, credit unions, maybe cryptocurrency providers, are who have to serve those industries if they are going to be served legally. In the alternative, those that are in this business have to find alternatives means of financing, which may mean operating a purely cash business, which, as I'm sure David would agree, is an open invitation to greater involvement by organized crime, as all cash businesses often are, and make such businesses more vulnerable. There are similar collateral effects that federal prohibition has on the regulation of the legal profession, on how people report their taxes and the expenditures related to their businesses, on whether or not someone can lawfully purchase a gun if they are also a medical marijuana user, and so on. So the fact of the federal prohibition, even though the federal government is not enforcing that prohibition very widely, distorts what occurs at the state level and distorts it in very unhelpful and in some cases destructive ways. In the book that I edited for Brookings, there's a chapter by Julie Hill from the University of Alabama that goes through in detail what the consequences are of not allowing legitimate, reputable, nationally licensed and regulated banks provide the financial backbone for otherwise lawful marijuana businesses, and it facilitates some of the concerns that David is raised in his remarks. Now, one response to this might be, well, maybe the federal government just needs to get serious about prohibiting marijuana. It's illegal on the books. The Supreme Court upheld it wrongfully, in my view, in Gonzalez versus Raich. But maybe that's the answer. Well, the reason that's not the answer is because the federal government couldn't enforce the prohibition on marijuana on the ground, even if it wanted to. Under our Constitution, the federal government may not commandeer. The state and local governments may not force state and local governments to enforce and implement federal law. If the federal government insists upon federal law being enforced, it has to do it itself. And the federal government doesn't have the ability to do that. The Drug Enforcement Agency globally has fewer agents than there are state and local law enforcement officers in Washington and Colorado, the first states to allow for recreational marijuana. The reality is the federal government does not have and will not have the boots on the ground necessary for the retail enforcement of marijuana prohibition. So we have a situation where, in terms of our overall governmental structure, it's not something the federal government should be doing. In terms of allowing states to adopt their own policies, it's not something the federal government is facilitating. And if the federal government wanted to impose its policy preferences, it couldn't do that even if it wanted to. We could perhaps imagine a fantasy world in which the federal government dramatically expanded the DEA into a national police force, but we all know that is not going to happen, and I would argue constitutionally something like that would be an abomination. So what should we do? Because I said that I'm not happy with the status quo. Well, the reality is we know how to handle this sort of problem. We've dealt with this with alcohol. When alcohol prohibition was ended, that did not make alcohol legal throughout the United States. What the federal government did is it said, look, at the federal level, alcohol production, distribution, possession will be lawful. But for purposes of federal law, it will remain unlawful to distribute, manufacture alcohol in contravention of applicable state law or with the intention of violating applicable state law. And what that has done with alcohol, as with other substances that are under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, is it gives the federal government the authority and the ability to be a backstop to states, to help states maintain and preserve their individual choices on when it comes to alcohol policy, and I would argue that's what should be done with marijuana policy. It creates the legal framework for the federal government to focus its efforts, focus its resources in those areas where states individually are largely incompetent in terms of protecting themselves, and that is protecting themselves from the importation of things in violation of state law. Again, that's what we've been doing with alcohol for a century. It's something we could easily do with marijuana if we chose to do it as well. And one of the things this would do, and this is my last point, is this would allow states to play the role that they're supposed to play of adopting those laws that relate to public health, safety, and morals that reflect the preferences of the people that live within those state jurisdictions, and allow the different states to learn from each other what mix of laws, what mix of criminal penalties, criminal restrictions, civil restrictions, and the like best help people achieve the balance that they want within the jurisdiction that they live in, and also preserves the possibility of people, if their jurisdiction does not satisfy their preferences, of having other jurisdictions that they may move to. This is something that we've seen in most areas of law, should see in most areas of law, and we should see in marijuana as well. Now, I happen to believe, if one looks at the empirical evidence of what's been happening in Washington State and Colorado and other states that have legalized marijuana, we see that the predictions of both those that predicted nirvana and those that predicted oblivion were both wrong, that the effects thus far on the margin appear to be much less than both supporters and opponents predicted. But the reality is, this is still something that we are learning about. It is still something that we are discovering. And again, that is how the Federalist system is supposed to work. It's supposed to allow states to adopt different mixes of policies based on what the people of those states believe will maximize their welfare, and allows us to learn and discover whether or not our predictions about what will maximize welfare in fact do so. That process has served us well. We should allow that process to serve us in marijuana. And if David's fears are justified, I think the evidence will be in without making the mistake at the national level. If David's fears are wrong and Tom's predictions are correct, well, then these experiments will reveal that too. But again, reducing the downside risk by allowing us to proceed at the state level. And if it turns out that as a result of these experiments, that people in Colorado are happy having a dispensary in every neighborhood or in every community, and people in Nebraska or Oklahoma are happy not having that, well, then it will preserve that option as well. And so I think what we really need to do is to allow for real marijuana federalism that is not going with the status quo. It is rather adopting at the federal level the policies that we adopted with regard to alcohol, so that we can allow real federalism in this space. And I will stop there, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Adler, and all of you spoke with so much richness that I could easily spend the next 3 days, I wouldn't say cross-examining, but asking to tease out some of the ideas that you all presented, but especially because there's limited time, and because I have a almost real-world question, at least for an ivory tower academic like myself. It's as real-world as I'm going to get. Let's pretend I just got a text from the Biden transition team. And they said, here's the political reality. We campaigned on decriminalization and got 75 million votes. So there are definitely people who are expecting us to live up to that promise made. Whether we'll be able to keep, different question. At the same time, no matter how things work out in the special election in Georgia, this is not going to be a Congress that's going to just want to blank check anything we as an executive branch want to do. And in fact, we're pretty confident we don't want to do this in the first 100 days, maybe not in the first year, maybe not ever, because we understand for some of the reasons that Mr. Murray emphasized, for others that express particular concerns about public health, even if there's a time to do marijuana reform in the midst of a pandemic and other drug problems, this may not be it. But we think we should do something. We both made a commitment to do something, and there's a lot that needs to be done no matter which of your perspectives we were to embrace. We recognize there's work for the federal government, for the executive branch in particular, to be doing. And we can't just, and I'll sort of express my criticism of both of the last presidents, just put our head in the sand and hope this issue goes away, because it obviously won't. And the states have shown that they're going to keep moving forward in a variety of ways, whether we pay attention to them, whether we channel their work or not. So given that political reality right now, what would be your advice of what we could do, again, attentive to both the political reality that is so challenging and the practical realities on the ground that are so dynamic and so fast moving? What can we as an executive branch on our own reasonably do right now that would be a healthy move forward as a matter of policy and practice? And anybody can jump in as they see fit.
Well, I think one suggestion would be to reinstate or reissue the equivalent of the Cole memo, from the Obama administration. You know, having said that, even though the Cole memo was rescinded under the Obama administration and authority was given out to each United States attorney to use their own discretion, I think what we saw was a de facto Cole memo policy preference for each United States attorney. I think the week after that memo was rescinded, we attended a luncheon with Justin Herdman here in the Northern District of Ohio, and we asked, what will your office's policy be on federal marijuana law enforcement? And he basically ticked through all of the Cole memo policy priorities and said, we're worried about human trafficking and cartels, et cetera. So even putting the equivalent of the Cole memo back in place, I don't know that it would make a material difference on the ground for legal operators. But I also might suggest that even if Congress isn't ready to totally deschedule marijuana under federal law or create some type of national framework, they can tinker around the edges. The Safe Banking Act being one of the primary examples to make sure that legal state operators have full access to financial institutions. It makes it easier to track money through this industry and to allay some of the concerns that David raised about, transnational cartels really having their fingers in the pie, so to speak. So I think those might be the two areas that you might be able to get some easier movement, even from a Congress that is less enthused about marijuana reform.
Professor, might I answer some of that, some of which I understood as well thought out. My concern is I was trying to leverage the discussion in a way to say, if we continue to focus on only one aspect of this potential federal role, the possession and use and the criminal justice system arresting people, that's not where the criminal justice system has actually been going anyway for years. And that's just but a minor dimension of the overall problem of this as a global problem. And I don't think we're yet lifting our eyes up to what the nature of the crisis is with regard to production, distribution, finances, and the violent enterprises that are pressuring us into this system. And everywhere we see them, they penetrate and capitalize on us to our great disadvantage, regardless of our high order intentions to prevent injustices at the level of arrests of kids behind the stadium with a doobie. That's not what the crisis is, it seems to me. If you think about the Safe Banking Act as being positive, and I think Jonathan spoke the same way, as though this would be something to help because this cash business is vulnerable. I don't think you appreciate, or forgive me, I'm not sure people have grasped the degree to which serious concerns are still seen in our system at the highest level with the penetration of our banking apparatus for money laundering purposes, from casinos, HSBC, that may come to mind for people who followed money laundering crises and corruption scandals, Wachovia, Bank of America. All of these institutions have been cracked and have paid serious fines and been penalized for their current participation in global money laundering schemes. The opening of the US financial services and banking services to what are clearly problematic gray area enterprises that try to capitalize on the legitimate business of those who are trying to establish marijuana industries. They will find ways to coerce, penetrate, and co-opt the activity is our concern. And efforts to so leverage the opening of the banking system, for the most part, have fallen at the Senate level. That is, they've been advocated at the House level. There may or may not have been at Obama administration, which President potential Biden may reinstill, but they've been resisted strongly by a core of senators, oftentimes from border states, who have a very keen awareness of what's at risk and how serious the threat is that looms outside their door with regard to the criminal organizations. And finally, though we may be running an experiment of a sort with regard to federalism and policy outcomes, I assure you, we are running an experiment that we no longer control on the longitudinal effect on youth of 70, 90% potency THC, teratogenic impacts, neurotoxin impacts, that we are not aware of what the consequences are. And we're starting to see the early signs since around 2012 with Colorado, and then the commercial market, and then the very high potency commercial market, and then the intensification of use in adolescence. Those signs are only now beginning to show up. And I would say you're not sufficiently frightened by what we're starting to see to know what the public health catastrophe in the mental health arena is looming and the scope that it will present. So I do not see Colorado as a success, and I'm perhaps an alarmist, or perhaps I spend a lot of time in the intricacies of the science of this, and things have turned very, very troubling. That is storm on the horizon.
If I could jump in, I'll say a couple of things. I mean, my recommendation to the Biden administration would be that certainly to support not simply banking reform, but the States Act generally. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous that the federal government's position or adopts a set of legal framework that means that someone who uses marijuana for medical purposes under state law can't purchase a handgun, can't exercise one of their fundamental constitutional rights, even though there's no evidence that their medicinal use of marijuana poses a threat to anyone. And they're acquiring a gun and that condition doesn't. Whether or not marijuana should be legal or not, that's something that, again, I think can be done at the state level. Pushing for a passage of something like the States Act, which had been co-sponsored by Senator Gardner of Colorado and Senator Warren of Massachusetts, I think makes sense. If it were allowed a vote in the Senate, I think it would clearly pass. It would have passed in the prior Senate. It would certainly pass in the new Senate if allowed to come to a vote, and we know that something like that would pass in the House. I think something like that is far superior to the Cole memo. The Cole memo was a facade. It was pretend. We all know that given all the other things that U.S. attorneys have on their plate, very little marijuana other than documented trafficking or conspiracies that are focused on distribution to children are going to rate in terms of their priorities. They don't have the staff, they don't have the resources to make marijuana a higher priority. That is why, as Attorney General Barr has himself testified before Congress, the overall priorities of the U.S. Attorney's offices has not changed. He felt that the Cole memo and Ogden memo were irresponsible because the Justice Department should not take off the table enforcing certain federal laws. But he has made clear that in terms of the actual practice on the ground, nothing would change. I've talked to the folks in the U.S. Attorney's offices in Colorado. They will tell you the same thing. And so we shouldn't return to that kind of pretend federalism, that pretend change. We should actually advocate the real change. And I think the way you facilitate that is by reassuring those jurisdictions that don't want to legalize that what you're doing at the federal level is not going to change what is legal on the ground in those jurisdictions. David and I disagree about what the empirical evidence shows. There is a chapter in the book by a team of empirical researchers showing the empirical trends that we've seen. We don't see dramatic changes in trends, things like suicide and the like that can be linked to marijuana. There are broader trends with our youth that predate the changes in a handful of states with marijuana. We don't see increases in marijuana treatment admissions and the like. And I should say, we don't see dramatic changes in the other direction that advocates of legalization had predicted either, right? There were folks that predicted that allowing marijuana legalization would mean people would use marijuana instead of opioids, and it would make the opioid epidemic go away. Those sorts of predictions turned out not to be true as well. And I refer folks to the chapter in the book, which has extensive data and charts and tables on the various trends. But again, my view is different jurisdictions should be allowed to make this choice. They should be allowed to make this trade-off, just as we do with other substances. And I think the Biden administration could actually gain a lot of political benefit from saying, we are not going to impose the progressive agenda on the entire nation. We are rather going to do more to recognize the broad diversity of views and values and perspectives in our nation and allow California to be California while allowing Oklahoma to be Oklahoma. I would encourage them to do that as opposed to rescheduling, pushing for full legalization or anything of that nature. And maybe if Elizabeth Warren is in the cabinet, she'll push that too.
All right, well, I'm not going to get into cabinet positions just yet. I have one last question that's going to piggyback off of something that was raised in the Q&A, and it's sort of the the spirit of Lord Devlin here a bit about sort of the role of morals, and I especially want to kind of pose it in a challenge. And the challenge is, imagine you're talking to somebody who just thinks it's morally wrong to use marijuana, and that's their firm position, and they certainly are troubled given that position in a legal regime that either allows it or especially would be perceived to be promoting it through allowing commercialization of marijuana and use and the like. And so if you're a supporter of reform, what would you point them to? What would you want to talk to them about? Who would you suggest they speak to about that basic fundamental view that it's morally wrong to use cannabis and marijuana, and that's why, you know, their opposition to reform is sort of based in that basic morals. But we can flip it around. If you're concerned about reform, specifically, imagine you're talking to somebody who believes quite forcefully it's morally appropriate to let people do to their own body whatever they would like to do. And if they believe it's useful to consume cannabis, they should be allowed to do that. And it's actually a moral position for the law to safeguard that, to prevent them from being subject to either the formal criminal sanction, but even the threat, have the state out there telling them it's inappropriate to do this activity that is just about self-activity. And so if your concern is with reform, what do you tell to that person who thinks it's a moral good, not just that this is not prohibited, but that the state really, as a fundamental matter, should stay out of being involved in what individuals do to their own body? Is there a particular bit of datum? Is there a particular person to talk to? Is there a particular perspective you'd like that person to think about when they come into this debate? And I really bring this up because I do think fundamentally, as much as we've turned to what you might call sort of a demoralized conversation, right? One where we want to look at the effects and we debate the effects. And we've heard today, Dr. Murray, it's been bad in Colorado. Professor Adler and Tom would say, no, it's been good, or at the very least, it's not obviously bad. Well, how anyone views that evidence, I think, is necessarily filtered through, do I think this activity is one that I ought to be troubled by, or ought to be troubled if it's prevented? And I would just like to sort of, as a final thought, since we're running out of time, and this is the one main question, what do you say to that person that says, yeah, maybe there's some good effects, but I just think it's wrong to pollute your body this way? Or, hey, there may be bad effects, but I think it's wrong for the state to prohibit somebody from having their life go in the course they want to, even if that is one that's harmful to themselves, from your perspective. What's the basic answer to that question?
I'd say I'll just start real quick and make two quick points. One is those sorts of questions are questions in our constitutional system we have always dealt with at the most local level possible. And because we recognize people have those differences. And when we have distorted that, it's usually not ended well. There are a lot of examples of us unnecessarily federalizing or nationalizing questions that are really about community mores or trade-offs between different conceptions of health and safety as opposed to other things. And that's important. Second thing I would say is that we need to recognize that the law's signaling message does not always have the effect that we want it to. And just as we should recognize that not every sin should be a crime, we should also recognize that for some populations, particularly youth, making something taboo may have the opposite effect. There is some evidence from Colorado that while overall recreational use of marijuana has gone up, that youth use has not. And the hypothesis, which I don't think we know enough yet to say one way or the other, is that marijuana it's not as rebellious anymore because and so some portion of youth are less likely to use it. So I don't think we should assume that our moral views should necessarily mean we criminalize things and use the coercive power of the state. And we should not always assume that using the coercive power of the state is the best way to expand our views of what it means to live a virtuous life.
And one thing I would say to somebody who has a moral opposition to using marijuana as well is, again, and I said this to start, I mean, prohibition hasn't worked. Marijuana is widely available. As David said, I'll use his language, high potency marijuana is widely available, and it's more potent now than it has been. And we have prohibition. So it's not, if the intent of keeping it illegal is to stop people from having access and using it, it has not worked. And so you have to also have the conversation of at what point do we go from, what's the difference between bad policy, good policy, or better policy? And if you think that marijuana usage is wrong, but people are using it anyway, then how can you address some of the other harms that might be associated with using marijuana in an unregulated market, right? How do you make sure that marijuana that's purchased by a consumer isn't laced with fentanyl or some other harmful substance? How do you make sure that the person selling marijuana doesn't have an ulterior motive to get you hooked on opiates or fentanyl, and not use marijuana as the to sort of upsell, bad word or bad phrase in this context, but to upsell you to those maybe more harmful substances. And the only way to do that is in a regulated market. So if you have concerns about marijuana usage, we know that people are going to use it anyway. So how do you adopt what might be sort of a harm reduction model in opening a regulated market to control some of those other collateral harms?
Professor, is there time for me to make one last comment?
I think 2 minutes left. I want to make sure Jim has a chance to wrap us up. So go ahead, you get the last word.
Thank you. This last question, the moral framing, I'm surprised by the question, particularly the way you structured it out there. I thought it was a little, I think it foreclosed a better understanding we might have had. First of all, I don't know anyone in the arena who argues marijuana is morally wrong. I've never actually met them in the drug policy circumstance, but people like to trot that out the way the French used to trot out the Catholic Church and the priest says, the reason why we can't get humans liberated and so forth, it's an available cudgel to say that this is moralism rather than clean clinical public health, making the right determination. And then I heard you say that those who read the literature about what's coming out, the actual data, and dwell in and invest themselves in the data of what's happening on the ground with youth treatment, with emergency admissions, with the fMRI scans of their brains, are somehow filtering it through their moral prejudices, strikes me as being a little bit unfair. I think it is quite possible for one to be, as much as possible, a scientist with regard to trying to evaluate, assess, and interpret the evidence when one comes to making public policy. And third, to hear Jonathan say that we handle moral issues in this country at the local level does seem to rather forget slavery, which seemed to actually rise above the local level because people felt slavery was a moral wrong, as I recall, in many instances. Now, oddly enough, the dependency and enthralldom that drug abusers fall into and the deep and earnest yearnings to regain their agency, not just their health, their agency, so that they are not enslaved, which is the term addict, it's a Roman term, actually enslaved to the substance, and who controls the substance controls them. And the more the state enters into the business of ensuring or providing or dispensing or overseeing or regulating the business, that increases your risk of actually being entrapped in a lifetime of dependency, strikes me as, from a libertarian perspective or a federalist perspective, as problematic. That the state is actually an actor in making a riskier outcome than does the circumstance where we should not struggle against this substance's impact and the effort to recover on the part of those who come to us seeking help and treatment. And then finally, the fantasy that there is some set of activities involving the consumption of intoxicating substances that only affects the person who imbibes them has to be overcome. This is producing effects on neighbors, on parents, on children, on the unborn, on the person themselves and all who love them. I think this is not a proper understanding of the isolation and sort of atomic severance of a society that actually cares about recovering addicts.
So, Dr. Murray, I appreciate I'll throw in an extra final point by saying your final comments really tap into my own limited historical understanding of the conversation post-slavery, pre-alcohol prohibition, where progressives were very much inclined to make a host of those kinds of arguments exactly. Frederick Douglass, in fact, was a quite vocal temperance advocate because of a vision of enslavement that King alcohol was described as, and of course the progressive movement was very much driven by the idea that alcohol wasn't a personal freedom, it was one that was affecting the family. Though I will emphasize, again, highlighting how morals integrate to this, that a set of moral commitments were often deeply embedded in a view of what is personal liberty and what is community activity, right? And I especially think, just to provide a little bit of modern history, that the last 8 months have shown us that an ability to read scientific text differently is sometimes very much connected to a range of political and moral commitments. Otherwise, I think we would not have seen quite as much controversy over how we responded to the ongoing pandemic, because at the end of the day, as much as many of us, I think probably everyone on this webinar would like to imagine science is distinct from morality in some sort of clean way, that itself bespeaks a kind of lack of sophistication of an understanding of the way in which both science is produced and morality finds a way of informing all that we do. And so
Okay.
with those final sentiments, I thank everybody for being involved, as is always the case. A conversation about marijuana reform becomes about so much more, and that's why it's so important to have them done with such smart and engaged and significantly studied people as we've been lucky enough to have here today. Jim, I want to give you or Brett or anybody else a chance to have the last word, but I've been, as I always am, gratified to just be able to play a small role in this important conversation.
Yes, well, thank you everyone for an excellent and robust discussion on such an important topic. Again, I'd just like to thank both FedSoc and DEPC and for everyone persevering to finally be here today. And to our panelists, we're grateful. And to Professor Berman, we thank you for being our moderator. And I just want to remind
Jim for doing all the hard work, and Brett as well. Thank you so much. It's not easy these days, especially when you have.
Well done.
Thank you. I very much appreciate it. And just want to remind everyone who's still on this webinar to stay tuned for some FedSoc programming next semester, and also to DEPC's event on the drug policy implications of the 2020 elections that will be taking place on November 16th. So I just want to thank everyone for being here and stay safe.
Thank you so much.